Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCGO codes, including the stuff from Silver Tempest, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we are going to be looking at some updated decks and also have a little meta chat before the Liverpool Regional Championships. This will be the last tournament in the Sword and Shield 2 Silver Tempest format before we get the introductions of Crown Zenith. And it's a tournament that I'm attending, so I've been putting a lot of testing in and paying close attention to the metagame. So we'll be looking at sort of the top decks in the game and also having a look at the Trainer Hill data and sort of talking through where I think we're at. So we'll start off with Lugia, of course. One of the more recent videos I did, the top tier tweaks video, I think it was from last week, is still a list that's fresh on my mind, where I was playing double Collapse Stadium and double Tool Jammer. That's definitely something that I think about quite a lot if I'm expecting a lot of Reggies, because the list in front of you is sort of not respecting Reggies all that much, but it's got a good amount for sort of the rogue elements of the room, with Vicavolt Aerodactyl getting a first and second place in regionals recently. It does make sense to respect Aerodactyl to an extent, and Cancelling Clone is this really nice catch-all option that can help us out against not only Aerodactyl V-Star, but also against Weezing, also against Duraludon, also against Miltank, all this random stuff. So the Cancelling Clone seems very solid. It also has synergy with a Raikou that we're playing in the deck, because you could potentially gust up a Manaphy and Cologne on the same turn. It would require a pretty good combination all in hand, but you're mostly trying to do this against Lost Box, and they're not really a deck that hand disrupts you too often. So the Cologne Raikou is a little mini package that we have going on here. The Raikou can be pretty handy for Mirror, but I actually like it most for Lost Box, to be honest with you, because it puts a lot of pressure on them alongside the Stoutland. So you have potentially two windows to take a 2-prize turn, and the Raikou is really valuable, of course, because it's just a 1-prize attacker. So the Stoutland can be responded on immediately for a 2 for 2, but the Raikou can actually +1 you, which is really, really important, because oftentimes the Lugia tanks a hit in that matchup quite often if they're going to hit it early on with a Cram, then trying to finish you off with a Snorlax or something like that. That's often how your first Lugia will go down. So trying to have a 2 for 2 here with Stoutland, a 2 for 1 with Raikou, and then hopefully your Lugia takes 2 in terms of value, or if you've gone second, it's been hit twice by the time you've done one Tempest Dive, then you're hoping to like jump into the deck with Fish and whatnot to force more 1-prizes into the active. Things like Regigigas and Charizard can be annoying ones for them to deal with specifically, so those are good cards in the deck. Speaking of which, I am playing a Regigigas. You can see that my 16th energy is also Twin Energy. This is again to help out a little bit because we have the Clones in the deck, so then that becomes a new combination with Duraludon, which I think is pretty nice. But also this is really good against Mew players, of course, because it's again an up trade. I don't think the benefits of having a Drapion in the deck makes sense anymore, because I don't expect much Mewtwo v Union control. Because I'm crossing my fingers here, I'm hoping that Rayquaza Lost Box, being the most popular Lost Box these days, means it's a really tough time to be playing Mewtwo v Union control. I think there'll be, if anything, different control variants brought to the table. So Reggie helps out in that regard. It's better against Mew than a Drapion would be, and it's, even though it is an awkward lead, because it does have a pretty high retreat cost, we are playing Double Fish Birdkeeper to at least move out of the way if we have to, and it can still be decent in, like I said, the 1-prize matchups here and there, especially with the 16th energy being a twin. It goes nicely on Yveltal, Gigas, Charizard. Even Guru can come in and deal with a Comfey early on. You can obviously work on your speed wings. So yeah, it seems like a reasonable 16th energy to me when we are going down this direction. So this is a Lugia that I guess is kind of like Lost Box teched and Mew teched. The mirror is what it is, and we have the sort of we can beat nonsense elements with double Cologne in the deck, which is a nice feeling. I think there are going to be some, it's nice to have that catch-all kind of card in your deck, because there are these sort of 5% creeping up. We saw that Weezing was, I think, the 7th most played deck in the last American Regional, which is pretty unheard of, to be honest. It's not really got the results to back it up, and it didn't do particularly well at the last regional, but people are willing to target exactly Lost Box and exactly Lugia for these tournaments, and Eternatus is a decent example of that. So having the Colognes to protect you, and again, I'm respecting Aerodactyl Not just creeping into Vicavolt decks, but also some Arceus decks have been creeping up recently. I did one on the channel myself, and we'll look at a list again today. So having Cologne to basically embarrass their use of an Aerodactyl seems really, really good to me. And also I just don't want to lose on the spot to someone going first against me that got an Aerodactyl and then I can't play the game. That doesn't sound too fun. So I wanna play the game if I'm playing Lugia as much as possible. I was just touching on Rayquaza Lost Box. This is the one that I've put the most time into, so I'm most happy with this list of all the Lost Boxes that we'll look at today. I think Rayquaza Lost Box is still really, really solid. There are some decisions going on in this deck where I'm up to 3 copies of Raihan. This is mostly to protect ourselves against Marnies and Judges, and just having high access to this card is really, really important, especially against things like Stoutland and whatnot, so that you are put under that clock quite quickly, so having the Rayquaza instant impact can be pretty massive. Outside of that, I'm playing just a 2/2/2 of all my energies, but I am playing double Training Court. I really like having access to my abilities, and seeing as though Mew and Regis can be path-based decks that shut off your Radiant Greninja, I want instant access to those again. Plus, there's great synergy with Court and Guru, where you can get a card to hand and put it directly into deck without having to use one of the ordinary rods to activate your Mirage Gate. Speaking of ordinary rod, I'm actually not playing Energy Recycler because, again, I'm at triple Raihan and double Training Court, so I think I get to buy the space to have the third rod. I think it gives me better access to Manaphy in Mirror and allows me to cycle it that little bit easier, which I think is really important because obviously people are trying to target down Manaphy often so that they can get their amazing shots in. I'll be trying to do the same thing, no doubt. And although they continually Sableye Sprinklet, they run out of Zignet pings, right, eventually. So they're not constantly taking a 2-prize knockout, which is what a Raikou would be doing if a Manaphy wasn't on the board. So it is important to recycle that Manaphy. And also a small note as well, compared to having like one recycler double rod, if you were to prize one of those pieces, if you had a 2-1 split, it would feel really awkward, right? You'd feel very light on energy recovery if I was like lower on Raihan, lower on Training Court, and just relied on the one recycler, which ends up being prized, then it has a really bad feeling. Or if you only play 2 rod and 1 gets prized, then you can be in a really awkward position. Especially if you've had some awkward loss zones, which we all know, of course, that this deck can have. So yeah, pretty simplistic 60. This list doesn't have many answers to Flying Pikachu or Ice Cube, so you could think about possibly cutting one of the ropes in turning it into a Echoing Horn. Definitely something I'm considering. And there is still Vicavolt popping up. There are a few tech cards that I've definitely thought about adding in to Lost Box to improve that. I know Nick Moffat played Zapdos V, Galarian Zapdos V. I don't think that's necessarily the best, and I think with a triple Raihan-based build, I could easily see a Vivid Voltage Zygarde coming into the list. The upside of Zygarde is it could be used in the mirror because of its high hit points, and also it can knock out a Stoutland again thanks to weakness as long as there's not a Dunsparce in play if you're behind on prizes, and it just has a really high hit point threshold, which I think is kind of interesting. The other one that I would think about is Miltank, actually, because Vicavolt has very few Miltank answers, and even if they are playing answers to deal with a Miltank, it's probably them breaking their item lock from a Vicavolt, right? And as soon as they break item lock, you're going to have a field day against them. So if you really want to tech for a Vicavolt, which I still think it won't be 5% of the metagame, even after a regional win and a second place. But if you want to, you can play an easy one-off Miltank in your Lost Boxes, no matter which one you're looking at today. And you're going to completely flip-flop what is otherwise a bad matchup for Lost Box. And one of the main reasons putting some people off, possibly, at this tournament. So let's have a quick look at the Zard Lost Box. This is the same 60 I ran at the previous regional. Again, I'd possibly consider Miltank. This even plays Twin Energy to try and get use out of it in a different angle. But I've taken this list as far as it can go. I think I don't want to make any changes to the 60 unless, again, I wanted to play Echoing Horn or something similar. I could potentially change this arena for a boss. Other than that, I'm still happy with this list. It's still performing pretty well in my testing. The Kyogre Lost Box, I do like the new inclusion of the Dragonite V. I actually was kind of sus of this, but now that I've seen Vicavolt, Dragonite is like, it's a good enough card against Vicavolt, but also has like other great utility options. Like it's good against Duraludon, it's good at shredding through good old Ice Cube as well, so it just has enough uses to probably be worth that slot. So we are adding in the Lightning Energies and the Zero Aura as well, just to help out. This is very similar, I believe, to James Cox's list that he's been playing like 750 games of to get 500 wins with. So with him playing so many games with the deck, it gives me confidence that he's probably ironed out the list at this point and has figured out the value of certain cards. So yeah, definitely good to see James putting in so much work and dedication to one deck list. I definitely think you get diminishing returns after the first 200 games, but good for you. Good to see. Let's have a look at the Mew-based builds. Again, not too much to say here. Not too much has changed. I've added in an Avery recently into the Mew because I just don't like the data around Reggies. I think they farm Mew a little bit too much. So I think respecting it, adding in the Avery and the double Lost City is a bit of help here, and still having just the 2 Judge and the 1 Roxanne. I think we cycle enough cards into the deck that you can recycle these anyway with Pal Pad and whatnot, that you don't need to have the full like 3 or 4 copies. You get away with just the 2 count very often. And there's still the Fusion Mew if people want to go down that direction. This is, again, unchanged from the last time I did top tier tweaks. It was only last week, so not too big of a surprise. And I still like the ropes over cross switches because I just like the spaces it gives me. Giving me 2 Rotom Phone spaces just is such a good feeling to get into the game and actually hit your combo when you do go second or whatever, and you still have that huge power spike and get into the game and try and tempo out on people. It is still a really big threat, so definitely not one to sleep on. Let's have a talk about Arcdura. It did make top 4 with Grant Shen, I think. It was either top 4 or top 8 recently. My list is quite close to his in terms of how I've shaped it up. I still personally like trekking shoes just because it's more universal than a poker gear throughout the game. But I am still shoving in 2 poker gears because I recognize how important it is to be Novering into Archeops in the Lugia matchup. I also still really value Collapse Stadium because I still think that Reggie's is a hard matchup for Dura because they're playing quad path and that's just not going to change. So I still like having the Collapsed in the deck. I've also debated Avery over one of the Colrus, but it's something I'm sort of flip-flopping on. I still think this deck is like kind of reasonable. It does have an awkward Mew, but outside of that, like it's still got a very solid matchup spread. And there's enough Lost Box right now sort of farming the Mew that there's some people put off, and then it just means Dura's like a good meta call. Speaking of Reggies, again, pretty unchanged. Reggie only changes like a couple cards here and there when need be. You could consider the Serena becoming a boss if you want to have rope boss plays into Ice Q, if you're worried about that, or you could go back to the Yell Horn if you really want to. But I'm just playing the one of rope for radar, or for sonar, I should say, to recover in need be. I'm at the 3 rod, which is always worrying, but the deck bricks all the time, so trying to streamline it as much as possible also has its merits. And yeah, Reggie's are still solid, to be honest. It's really good into the big 3 if they don't tech like heavily for you. I think the Raikou in Lost Box is kind of the scariest one for you to deal with out of the bunch. And it's a shame because that's kind of like the most played Lost Box now, I would say. Definitely more played than Charizard. I think Kyogre still has a decent number of people playing it as well. Also, the Dragonite can sometimes be a headache because it can be another thing that can take an extra hit sort of late on in the game, and they can try and force you to have a hand sort of thing to gust it back up, and you don't always have access to it, especially with only 2 Serena. And let's face it, when you're up against Lost Boxes, Reggie's, you're having to play all your cycle cards just to keep up because you have to take 6 individual prizes most of the time. The Serenas aren't necessarily valued in Lost Box, so they can sort of like capitalize on your Serenas being in the discard pile. So that's a little bit of percentage points lost, I think, against Lost Box. I think you're still fine into Mew. Like I said, I was putting Avery's back in to try and stabilize this matchup because it's not good for Mew in general. And the Lugia matchup, I still think is fine for you. You're not too afraid of Raikou coming in. You're happy to see Dunsparce mostly out, I would say. And Manaphy is like mostly in, I would expect. But that's not a huge issue for the most part. You can get away with it because they're not protecting a Dunsparce anymore. So you can still allow your Leckies to get free hits in here and there. In terms of weakness, I should say. If you are able to belt up. And there aren't any real like new decks that Reggie's is too concerned about, except a couple of the ones that we get onto today. The sort of Arc Binder Drop that I have done a video on just recently with the Pikachu package. Now this one is Flying Peak with Espeon, so you protect yourself against Regice, but also there's like Pika Parasol packages floating around right now, which is something to bear in mind. Definitely scary for Reggie's. Regis can turn off the Espeon, obviously, with their own paths, but this deck plays counter stadiums and it plays switch cards anyway, so they can move in and out and continually max balloon. And that's going to be a huge issue for the Reggie deck, no matter what, really. And I don't think there's much tech you can do as Reggie that doesn't like tear apart your own deck list. So I think that's just going to be a small headache for you. Arc Flying P plus Espeon is annoying for the Lost Box players, but they do have some interplay into it. This deck, where at least the list in front of you doesn't have a way to go lone Flying Peak, and I think that's where Lost Box is truly afraid. I think they're naturally playing Gust and Rope, so you're not too afraid of Max Balloon. It just forces a big hand, and this deck is trying to constantly Marnie and judge away a Lost Box player from having the Rope Boss Gate Rayquaza smack, because if that happens, it's kind of game over for you. This list does have a double Pikachu line, though, so it's possible that they can get through one Flying Peak and then you have another one coming at them and you're continually hand disrupting. So I think you should be good into Lost Box and good into Regis, if that's your priority. I think the Mew matchup is still dicey, even with a Drapion. I could see if you really just want to win that matchup, going to 2 Drapion, probably even up to 3rd Stadium, would be something I'd consider, just to have a better time there against it. And I think against Lugia, it's fine if you go first, because we have the Aerodactyl package with heavy Ball Search, heavy Incense, even Captures to try and get the early Aero developed. So that you can do that Ancient Star. Obviously, if they are playing Cologne, you've just lost on the spot. And if you've gone second against the Lugia, you're kind of bad, I would say. Like, you're really hoping that the Flying Peaks kind of like just survive. You try and set up a Flying Peak behind an Espeon and hope that they can not get Yveltal out, basically. Or you're hoping to respond on... So a Lugia comes in and swings and takes out your first V Pokemon. You're hoping to Nova KO onto an Archeops, and then you're just saying at that point they can't target my Flying Pikachu with a Yveltal all in one turn, cross my fingers, and then you're just trying to make that Pikachu go as far as it can, hitting for weakness and whatnot. But yeah, going second, it is a little bit of a dicey matchup, definitely against Lugia. This is sort of a counter toolbox, but you are still trying to juggle inconsistencies of its own deck when you've had to cut away the Drapion and such just to fit in all these tech... Sorry, not the Drapion, the Barrel and such, just to fit in all these tech Pokemon. The deck can crumble on its own self a little bit. But yeah, I still think some people will be gaining confidence in the sort of Arceus toolboxes. The Espeon can come in and swing as well when need be, so I wouldn't sleep on that sort of card. An interesting combination, and I think oftentimes late in the format when so many people are so focused on teching and having an answer to the top stuff, just judge and Marnieing people is a really good strategy. it's definitely slowing a lot of people down. And finally, I guess the last note would be to talk about Aerodactyl Vicavolt, the deck that's all about slowing people down. Again, Aerodactyl, we've had the rabbit out of the hat a couple times now. People don't seem to be caring or respecting Ancient Star. I still think it could be easily below 5% of the field, so it's up to you if you want to flip that coin where you could potentially face 1 or 2 day 1. I'd be surprised if you face 2 Aerodactyls in a day 1 competition, but that's just my own expectation of people gravitating towards the top decks. But this has been performing extremely well, and if anyone's jumping off a train, they could easily be getting onto the Vicavolt hype instead, where you do have generally a very good Lost Box, I would imagine, unless people are willing to tech against it. A very good Lugia, again, unless people are willing to tech against this deck. And your Mew is very good, and Mew can't really do anything to tech against Drapion, to be honest with you. Even if they are loss-eating away the Drapion and you're not able to recycle with Ditto, you have racing potential at that point with like a Raikou prize, or even just bringing stuff up and paralyze, trapping things sort of mid-game. It can definitely be a play. So yeah, I don't think it's a bad deck. I just think, at what point do we start respecting Vicavolt? Do you think enough players, now that it's won a regional, will be like, okay, I should have an answer to Vicavolt in my deck? Or do you still think this is going to be on those fringes? It hit the right matchups, went first enough times into Lugia at least to get into the game and just sort of play. I don't know, it's a bit of a question mark. I can see some people defaulting to it though, so I wouldn't write off Vicavolt. It's just whether or not you want to like tech heavily or just change your deck list entirely based on the threat of that deck. So that's kind of the main stuff I wanted to talk about today. Let's have a look at the Trainer Hill data. This is from the last month. There are a number of decks on here that I wanted to just touch on, but I'll also chop away from these to sort of look at what I think are the main takeaway points. So let's talk about the sort of more fringe stuff first. I think ultimately there's not much reason to be playing Zoro. You have a good Lugia and a good Mew, but like at this point your Lost Zone box is atrocious. Your Regis is unfavored, and you're really bad against like all the fringe stuff. Like if you're trying to flip coins with the Jirachi into Arctura, it's just sad. You know what I mean? So, yeah, I think you're too narrow of a matchup to play Zoro to go deep into a tournament. I still think you can day 2 with a Zoro Arc deck, but I just don't think you are likely to make top 8 with the deck, because I think you will take losses when you just hit your bad matchups, which are inevitable, and lost boxes coming up to like that 15% in meta share. So you're expecting to face it a couple times, right, at least. So let's have a look at some of the other fringe stuff. The Palkia sort of box of tricks has come out. It's sort of done its thing now that the meta has adapted to playing bird keepers in the Lugias and all this other stuff, and just Lost Box getting more popular and more lightning based. It's just worse and worse for Palk, so I don't think there's much reason to play that for this event unless you've got some new all singing all dancing variants. Arc Flying Peak, this is kind of what I'm hoping is going to be the data for the catch-all of this sort of counter toolbox. Maybe it's not quite perfect, but in theory it should be farming the Regis, should be pretty strong into the Lost Box. You're good into Lugia if you go first, you're bad if you go second, which is pretty much that 50-50, and you're okay into Mew, surprisingly enough, as well. This data could be skewed towards path builds of Arc Pikachu, which is kind of like a relic of the format right now, compared to what you're actually expecting, but again, I think if Arc does go first into Mew, it's actually pretty reasonable, especially with that Drapion in the back pocket. Going second, thanks to Drapion, you can fight the fight, but otherwise it's going to be pretty awkward. And surprisingly, the matchup's not too bad into Arctura. I thought it would be a little bit worse, because Arctura does have that extra bit of healing at its disposal, and the natural damage output isn't that high of Arc Flying Pikachu. But if you do have the Psych Energy Espeon package, it could be pretty scary. Let's talk Mewtwo v Union Control. The data looks really good for Mewtwo v Union. It seems to be only pretty awkward into Reggie, and I don't know how Dura is a low percentage. It should be pretty high for you, I'd expect. But basically, the Lost Zone box is showing as 47% here, a slight negative, but I think the more Lost Zone box tilts towards Rayquaza, the worse it gets to play Mewtwo. So maybe a Mewtwo deck plays a package of like Ice Cube and tries to get the job done there, but you're watering down your own deck. So I imagine if there's going to be any control, it won't be Mewtwo based. Eternatus was really heavily played for how good the deck is at the last American Regional. It's still negative into Lugia. It's still average against Lost Zone box. Like, sure, you're good into Regis just because you have Weezing, and you're okay into Mew because you're playing a Dark deck and having to play Drapion. So it's like, you could find so many things that have a better matchup spread than this deck. I wouldn't be surprised if it saw some play, but I don't expect it to do well at all. So this sort of narrows us down to sort of our top 5-ish decks. Unfortunately, there's not enough data on Vicavolt to really look at it, but like I said, you can tech for it for Lost Box. You can have a decent time against it with Lugia if you've gone first, or if you choose to play Cologne, you absolutely embarrass them. So sort of the top 2 decks that Vicavolt's trying to target, they can counter tech for you if they really want to, but it's whether or not you think people will actually commit their spaces to cards like Cologne or Miltank or anything else like that. Arctura seems pretty solid, to be honest. Like, I rag on it all the time, but it's actually got a pretty good matchup spread. And for me personally, I think it's a hard time to play Mew at the moment. Even though it consistently is the second most popular deck at Regionals in America, I don't know how easy of a play it actually is going into these tournaments because of its awkwardness into Lugia and Lost Box, like, over and over again. So having only an awkward Mew isn't necessarily the worst thing for me. You know, if I didn't just hate playing Arctura, I'd be really happy with this matchup spread. Honestly, the matchup spread that I'm just way more happy to play is Regis, but this is a deck I want to play even less. But the matchup spread is like, this is a no-brainer into the top 5. This is like, look, this should be the Bediff based on these numbers, right? This is the last month of data. This is hundreds of games in these matchups. And it's just like, it's so far ahead of all the other decks. There's just the stigma around the deck, and you know that it can brick and things aren't necessarily quite in your control. Obviously, there are plays you can make, but my goodness, it's such a strong deck. I still think it probably comes in behind Mew and Lost Box in terms of popularity, and obviously Lugia. But man, it seems to be, if you haven't played much Pokemon and just want to lock in a deck that, as long as you learn the deck in like 10 games, you can have a pretty good chance of doing well. I think the matchups are on your side as Reggie. You just have to hope the deck works enough of the time. Mew's kind of the same thing, where you'll find into most decks and your deck is usually more consistent. I've mentioned putting an Avery in, and again, it's just because I'm fearful of this number right here being weakened to Reggie. And Avery is like not a bad card regardless. It can be good in the mirror match as well at times, so I would see that coming into my Mew. Otherwise, your matchups are just fine, I would say, pretty much. The Lost Box actually isn't as bad as I think. I'm always thinking that Lost Box is like a really bad matchup for Mew, but that's because I'm still thinking about Charizard Lost Box in the back of my head. Because I played Drapion on a very high stadium count. I played 4 Stadium and Drapion in my Charizard build, so you just farmed Genesect Mew. But Judge Disruption is really good against Rayquaza-based builds. Sometimes you can just run away with the game with that, and you can just tank hits when they're just doing not much and having to hit you with crams and whatnot. So it can be pretty handy. Lugia is still fine. Obviously, there's not really a problem with it. Again, you could choose to tech for Reggies, and I would say double Collapse, double Tool Jammer, and Manaphy would be the best way to tech for Reggies. Or if you're worried about more of the fringe stuff, you can play the Cologne build that we looked at today. Lost Box is actually a weird one. Being worried about Dura is scary. But the rest of the time, you're really good. And I also think you can definitely inflate these stats with Lost Box if you're just a very solid Lost Box player and have put the time in with the deck. I think, honestly, it's one of the harder decks to play in the game right now. A lot of resource management required. You have to be able to have backup plans if you are getting railroaded by hand disruption, which can just happen with a deck. So I think you can inflate these win percentages the better the player you are with as Lost Box. So yeah, that covers sort of the big 5. Like I said, unfortunately, there's not good Vicavolt data on here. I would expect it to be good into Mew, good into Lugia, and good into Lost Box in theory. But it's how definitely Lost Box and Lugia tech, right? If they choose to or not is kind of the big question mark around Vicavolt. I can't be too against the deck because I think in general it should be pretty good, but there's also the headache of Vicavolt having to worry about Aerodactyls coming into other decks because it naturally just actually has a really good time against you. Like if the Arc Pikachu decks play Aerodactyl themselves, they can just have a field day bashing through your Vicavolts with weakness, which is pretty troll. But yeah, long ramble today. Let me know what you want to be playing. Has the data swayed your opinion if you're on the fence about a deck? How are you going to be teching out your Lost Boxes, your Lugias? Is it worth respecting Vicavolt? And what do you think is going to do well this weekend? I'll hear it all down below. Thanks so much for watching. Wish me luck, and I'll see you there in Liverpool. Cheers.